She was scrubbing the marble floor when the boardroom door cracked open. Inside, they laughed, calling her just the help. But Charlene had a law degree, and now she saw her name forged on a $90 million fraud deal. The pen was inches from the CEO's hand. She whispered, "That's the wrong contract." And then he signed it anyway. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was always the same elevator. The one with the mirrored walls, and the faint scent of disinfectant clinging to the brushed steel. Every morning at precisely 6:01 a.m., Charlene Davis entered through the back service entrance of Evercast Inc.'s 42-story glass tower in downtown Atlanta. Her uniform was crisp, her afro pulled tightly into a neat bun, her ID clipped just below her collarbone. Housekeeping contractor level 2 access. But no one ever looked at her badge. No one ever said good morning. The executives passed her like she was a coat rack. Janitors nodded. Security glanced. But for everyone who made decisions inside those glass walls, Charlene didn't exist. And that's exactly how she survived. She knew the building better than most interns. Knew which conference rooms had broken mics, which floors left behind the most discarded documents, which bathrooms the senior partners used when they didn't want to be seen. She knew which glass doors echoed private conversations when left cracked open. Most importantly, she knew how to listen without making a sound. In 8 years, she'd overheard jokes that curled her gut, words that would have made headlines if spoken outside of Evercast's high-gloss walls, but she never said a word. She had rent to pay, a daughter in college, and no appetite for battles she couldn't afford to lose. Yet beneath her quiet compliance lived a photographic memory, and a heart that remembered every slight. Charlene wasn't always a maid. 10 years ago, she was a litigation assistant at one of the top law firms in Georgia. She dressed sharp, spoke with precision, and knew how to read the fine print better than half the junior associates. But then she'd noticed something. A pattern. Resumes from black applicants were being flagged, misfiled, or lost in the shuffle. She reported it. They thanked her. Then 2 weeks later, they said her role was no longer a good fit. Since then, doors had been bolted shut. So she stopped knocking. At Evercast, no one cared who she used to be. That worked in her favor. She watched them from the corners of her eyes. The way the VPs strutted in $4,000 suits. How Trent Marshall, the charismatic young CEO, barked orders between sips of oat milk lattes. His hair always perfectly messy. His speeches polished with just enough southern grit to sound authentic. They praised him like a god. Called him the Elon of the South. His rise was meteoric, tech brilliant, and investor slick. But Charlene had seen him laugh a little too hard when one of the directors joked that diversity hires slow down progress. She'd smiled politely while sweeping under the glass conference table, but her fists clenched around the mop handle. Invisibility gave her freedom. But it came with scars. They thought she didn't understand. They probably think stock options are snacks, one staffer had once said, and the whole room erupted in laughter. Charlene laughed too quietly. But she remembered every syllable. The morning it happened started like any other. Charlene was restocking towels on the executive floor. Floor 41. The air was colder here. The lights dimmer. Doors opened with retina scans and soft chimes. She kept to her routine. Vacuum, polish, refill, exit. But when she reached the north wing, something unusual caught her attention. The doors to conference room A, where major merger talks had been happening for weeks, weren't fully closed. She heard voices. Trent's voice, smooth, firm. "We finalize this by end of day, and Solentrex becomes ours. No leaks, no mistakes." Another voice replied, "Contracts ready for signature. Slides into the folder after the financials. No hiccups." Charlene leaned slightly closer to the gap. Through the glass, she saw it. The folder. It was a thick black leather binder, embossed with gold. Standard issue for all legal transactions. One of the men, his name tag reading Ross Warren, opened the binder and carefully slid a contract inside. But Charlene's eyes narrowed. The top of the page peeked out just long enough for her to catch the bold title. Memorandum of Transfer Celtex Corp Holdings, not Solintrex. She blinked. She knew what she saw. Saltex Corp wasn't part of the merger talk. In fact, that name had come up weeks ago in a late-night conversation between two board members. One had called it the exit vehicle. She moved away quickly, wheeling her cart to the service stairwell. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Mistake? Typo? Or something worse. Back on floor 38, she ducked into the janitor's closet, locked the door, and pulled out her old burner phone, a cheap one she used only for emergencies. She took a breath, thought of her daughter, Nyla, who just made Dean's list, thought of her rent due in 5 days. What's one mistake? She told herself. It's not your job to interfere. But her gut wouldn't let her rest. By noon, the folder had been moved to the main boardroom for the final signature. Charlene returned to her duties like always. Head down, gloves on, invisible. But as she passed the boardroom, she stopped. The room was full. Trent stood at the head of the table, surrounded by directors, photographers, assistants, everyone poised for the final step in a $100 million deal that would redefine Evercast's future. Charlene was at the edge of the room, just inside the catering line, topping off the coffee carafes. She saw the contract being pulled from the folder. She saw Trent uncap the pen. Something inside her broke loose. She took 2 steps forward, and with a voice just above a whisper said, "That's the wrong contract." Time slowed. Heads turned, faces twisted in confusion. "What?" Trent blinked. She said nothing else, just stood still, her eyes never leaving the document. The room buzzed. A few people chuckled nervously. A senior VP muttered, "Is she talking to the CEO?" Trent laughed it off. "Appreciate the concern, but I think we've got it handled." And then he signed. The ink wasn't even dry before chaos started to flicker around the edges. One assistant checked her screen, paused, whispered something to the CFO. Brows furrowed, fingers typed faster. A silence began to creep in. Charlene had already stepped back into the hallway. She didn't need to see more. She headed toward the service elevator, keeping her face neutral. Inside, her hands trembled. But behind her in that gleaming boardroom, a storm was just beginning. Because what Charlene had seen wasn't just a wrong name. It was the first crack in a $100 million illusion. One morning, Charlene sees a contract being slid into a folder with a different name than what the CEO expects. The room was glass, steel, and cold silence. Charlene stood just outside the catering prep alcove, half hidden by a polished brass coffee cart. She clutched a stainless steel pitcher with trembling fingers, watching the room as if she were watching the world teeter on a knife's edge. Inside the Evercast executive boardroom, light poured in through massive glass windows, catching on diamond cufflinks and crystal water glasses. The table stretched like a runway, polished walnut, sleek and sterile. Surrounding it were 10 men, 3 women, all white, all dressed in blue or gray suits, tailored to intimidate. Trent Marshall stood at the head of the table like a man auditioning for his own statue. His jaw was squared, hair deliberately disheveled, and smile calibrated for charm. In front of him sat the black leather binder, the same one Charlene had seen earlier, the one hiding a contract bearing the wrong name. She had tried to warn them. She had whispered what she could. But whispers didn't carry much weight when spoken by the help. "You've all been briefed," Trent said, his voice smooth like a politician selling hope. "This merger puts us 10 years ahead of the curve. Solintrex's AI infrastructure gives us what no competitor has: real-time quantum processing. This is how we make Evercast untouchable." The board members nodded in rhythm. No one asked questions. Not one person looked toward the woman in a beige uniform standing quietly by the espresso machine. Charlene's stomach coiled tighter with each passing second. She'd seen the name Soltex Corp Holdings, not Solintrex Systems. She'd memorized it in a single glance, the way she used to absorb legal citations in her old life. It wasn't a typo. Soltex was a known placeholder shell company. In 2 IRS audits, she had secretly followed through online legal forums. But the connection was buried deep, and intentionally. She shouldn't have said anything, but something in her spirit refused to stay silent. "That's the wrong contract." Her whisper still echoed in her mind. It had caused a brief glitch in the performance. Trent had raised an eyebrow, turned halfway toward her, offered a confused smile to the room like he was humoring a child. "She's confused," one executive had chuckled. "Might have seen one too many folders." The whole table laughed. Charlene didn't move. Trent shrugged it off, and leaned over the binder. And then he picked up the pen. Charlene stopped breathing. He flipped the contract open to the last page. Silence fell. Even the assistants stood still, holding iPads like frozen statues. The gold fountain pen hovered, just inches above the paper. A lifetime passed. Then he signed. A camera clicked. Then another. The room erupted in polite applause, handshakes, congratulations. One woman popped a bottle of champagne, awkwardly, because she wasn't used to doing it herself. She was probably used to someone like Charlene doing it for her. Charlene didn't move. She stared at the signature, freshly inked on the bottom line, like it was an obituary. 15 minutes later, Trent left the boardroom flanked by two directors and his assistant, Kara Sullivan. Cameras followed him into the hall where the PR team waited with lighting and mics. "Mr. Marshall, is it true the deal's worth over 9 figures?" a reporter called. Trent smiled. "We believe in partnerships that push the edge of innovation. Solentrex isn't just a merger, it's a mission." Charlene moved her cart past them, eyes down. A flashbulb lit her face for a second. No one noticed. Back in the break room, Charlene leaned over the sink, breathing in shallow bursts. Her hands trembled as she rinsed the unused mugs. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. But how could she prove it? And more dangerously, did she want to? She thought of Nyla again. Her daughter's first semester at Spelman College. Tuition payments were eating into every spare dollar. She couldn't afford to lose this job. Not again. But Saltex. She remembered that name from a forum post written by someone called Black Eye 99. Nearly 2 years ago, an anonymous tipster who'd posted PDFs of shell company schemes tied to embezzlement, racial discrimination, and offshore laundering. The thread was taken down after 72 hours, but Charlene had screenshotted everything. She went to her locker, pulled out her phone, and searched for it. The screenshots were still there. Saltex Corp Holdings, registered in Delaware but routing money through Turks and Caicos. And now it had found its way into the Evercast boardroom. By late afternoon, murmurs were surfacing across the upper floors. Quiet ones, nothing concrete. Charlene listened like always, silently delivering paper towels, polishing the corners of glass walls, pushing her cart slower than usual, just to catch words slipping through half-open doors. Wiring instructions, different address, finance flagged it. Could be a formatting issue, contract audit, just routine. But something in their tones shifted from confidence to calculation. The veneer of certainty was cracking, and she saw it. She passed Kara Sullivan near the elevators. The assistant's face looked paler than usual. Charlene nodded politely. Kara didn't nod back. That wasn't new. But her eyes lingered on Charlene for half a second too long. Not curiosity, not familiarity.
Recognition.
Charlene's heart beat faster. She knows I saw it. That evening, as Charlene prepared to clock out, she noticed a subtle change. Her time card wasn't in its usual spot. Instead, a temp card with her ID handwritten sat in the slot. She asked the receptionist about it. "Oh," the young woman replied, avoiding eye contact. "Your regular card must have gone missing." Charlene didn't press. She slid the temp card into the machine and waited for the beep. But it didn't come. The machine blinked. Access denied. Charlene stared at the screen. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably. "Try again?" She did. Same result. 2 security guards by the lobby doors suddenly became more attentive. Charlene backed away calmly. "Must be a glitch," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. She took the service elevator to the basement. Texted her daughter just one word. "Fine." Then she walked to her car. Sat inside for 20 minutes without starting it. Thinking. Saltex was the wrong contract. That was certain. But what wasn't clear was why Trent had signed it anyway. Back at Evercast, after hours, 2 executives sat in a side office lit only by the glow of one laptop screen. The man with the laptop, Ross Warren, zoomed in on an image from the boardroom earlier that day. A still frame from a security feed. He pointed to a blurred figure in the background. "That's her. Right there." The other executive squinted. "She saw it?" Ross nodded. "She said something. I think she saw the name." The second man leaned back, expression tight. "Then we've got a problem." Meanwhile, Charlene finally started her car. The engine hummed softly, headlights washing over the empty lot. She stared ahead, not driving yet. Her mind returned to that moment in the boardroom. How the air changed the second she spoke. How she was dismissed like a background prop in a play. She had known they wouldn't listen. But what she hadn't expected was that they'd already planned for someone like her. The boardroom freezes, but Trent signs anyway. The applause hadn't even died down before the first sign of trouble emerged, quietly, almost invisibly, like a whisper crawling across the clean floors of Evercast Inc. In a cubicle 2 floors below the boardroom, a junior financial analyst, named Jeremy Fine, stared at his dual monitors, his eyes narrowing behind thick black frames. On one screen was the finalized merger contract, newly uploaded with Trent Marshall's signature. On the other was the company's wireframe for automated capital transfers. It was a post-signature procedure he'd been trained to verify, ensure the destination accounts aligned with Evercast's registered partnership information. Normally, it was routine 5 minutes max. But something felt off. He blinked. The routing numbers listed in the contract didn't match the ones on file for Sullentrex systems. At first he thought he'd clicked the wrong folder, but after triple-checking, the mismatch remained. The contract referenced a Cayman Islands account. That wasn't on any of the official paperwork. Not Delaware, not Georgia, not Nevada, Caymans. Jeremy hesitated. His throat went dry. His training told him to report discrepancies immediately, but his instincts told him to tread carefully. This was the biggest deal in the company's history, and the ink was still wet. Meanwhile, 2 floors above, Charlene was slowly wheeling her mop cart through the corridor near the legal offices. Her uniform was tucked away in her locker, replaced by a plain gray hoodie and jeans. She had already clocked out, but something in her gut wouldn't let her leave. She passed by the glass office of Elliot Harper, Evercast's vice president of finance. He was on the phone, speaking in the low, flat tones of a man managing panic. "I've already seen the transfer discrepancies," he muttered. "Yes, I understand it's too late to halt the signing. But the company name? It's not Sullentrex. It says Saltex Corp Holdings." Charlene's breath caught. She took a quiet step back, keeping the cart in front of her like a shield. Harper continued, voice sharpened by irritation. "No, the system didn't flag it, because the contract file name was embedded correctly. But the wiring instructions, they're not just wrong. They're different entities, different tax jurisdictions. It smells like a swap." There was a pause, then a bitter laugh. She said something before the signing. The maid whispered something about the contract being wrong. Another pause. "No. She's confused. Said it in passing. We brushed it off. HR's prepping a just-in-case file." A longer silence. "Come on, she's a maid. What could she possibly know?" Charlene's heart twisted. She backed away slowly, cartwheels squeaking ever so lightly, retreating before someone noticed. The words didn't just sting, they pierced. She's a maid. What could she possibly know? Back in the finance wing, Jeremy quietly escalated the discrepancy to his direct supervisor, a woman named Marla Brighton. She read his findings in silence, her face stone still. When she finished, she gave him a tight nod. "Thank you, Jeremy. Leave this with me. Don't forward it to anyone else." That was it. 15 minutes later, Jeremy's building access was downgraded. His badge no longer let him into level 4, where financial audit trails were reviewed. He hadn't even left his desk. Something was wrong, and someone was making sure it stayed buried. By 7:30 p.m., Charlene had made it home, her fingers aching from scrubbing boardroom corners, while her mind stayed 10 steps ahead. The voices she'd overheard that day echoed in her head. The laughter, the dismissal, the calculated indifference. They'd already started building a defense. Not against the mistake, but against her. She dropped her bag on the kitchen table and opened the one thing that had never let her down, her collection of digital receipts, saved screenshots, archived posts, whistleblower forums, encrypted Reddit threads, and court transcripts buried under numbers no one bothered to read. One name jumped out. Saltex Corp Holdings. She remembered where she'd seen it. A buried forum thread from a whistleblower, with the alias Black Eye 99. It had been posted 3 years ago, and taken down in less than 72 hours. But Charlene had screenshot the entire thing. Now she pulled it up again. There it was. A graphic of shell companies with arrows pointing to shadow accounts. One of the nodes blinked with the title Saltex, exit vehicle for high-risk transfers. Underneath it, in bold white font, "Not the first. Won't be the last." Charlene leaned back in her chair. It hadn't been a coincidence. It had been a play carefully crafted, quietly executed, and now it had landed on her watch. Outside, the city lights glowed over Atlanta like a muted battlefield. Inside Charlene's apartment, the only light came from her phone. She opened her email app for a quick scroll and then froze. A new message sat at the top. No name. No subject line. From unknown at securemail. Subject: careful eyes. See more than they should. Body: I saw what you saw. Don't stop asking questions. Black Eye 9. She stared at the screen. The words hit her like a silent scream. No attachments. No signature. No traceable metadata. Whoever sent it had used an encrypted relay. She recognized the formatting. It was the same kind of security layer whistleblowers used when leaking documents anonymously. This wasn't a scam. This was real. And it meant someone had been watching. Someone knew she had seen the contract. And more than that, they wanted her to keep digging. Her fingers trembled as she reread the final line. Don't stop asking questions. She opened a second tab on her phone, typing slowly. Careful eyes see more than they should. Quote origin. After several junk results, one line stood out. It was from a 2012 court transcript. A whistleblower trial. A black accountant who exposed systemic laundering at a real estate bank in Florida. In the final statement, his attorney had said, "Careful eyes see more than they're paid to." Charlene remembered that case. It was never publicized. The man vanished. But his digital alias? Black Eye Night. Her heart pounded. This was no amateur. This was someone who had been there. Someone who knew what it meant to see corruption and be erased for it. And now he had reached out to her. A second email appeared. Shorter. Sharper. Subject: if you want proof, go to this address. Tomorrow. Noon. Come alone. Body: 709 Wren Street. Storage unit. Charlene blinked. Wren Street. It was in the industrial corridor near the old shipping yards. A dead zone. Half the buildings there were abandoned or condemned. And yet the address existed. She knew it. She'd passed it on her bus routes years ago. But now, it pulsed like a trapdoor opening beneath her. She stared at the screen, her pulse racing. Every instinct told her this could be dangerous. But every part of her also whispered, "This is the moment. Don't back down." She locked her phone, took a deep breath, and whispered to herself the one truth she could no longer ignore. They didn't just make a mistake. They thought she'd never speak again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Charlene receives a secret email from someone using the alias Black Eye 99. Charlene sat at the edge of her bed as the early morning light seeped in through slanted blinds, painting faint lines across her bare arms. The silence in her apartment was deep, almost reverent. A storm was stirring outside, but the real storm was happening in her mind. Her phone rested beside her, the screen still displaying the address, 709 Wren Street. Storage unit. She hadn't responded. She hadn't dared. Not yet. Instead, her thoughts circled back, deeper than last night's chaos. Past the Evercast boardroom and its poisoned applause. Past even the echo of, "That's the wrong contract." They settled somewhere far more painful. Somewhere she never allowed herself to visit anymore. 10 years ago, Charlene had sat in a different kind of office. Not as a maid, but as a respected paralegal at Worthen and Cole LLP, one of the most powerful white-led law firms in Atlanta. She wore tailored slacks then, spoke in tight legal cadence, and drafted arguments that won courtrooms. Her performance reviews sparkled. Her work was airtight, and yet something never quite fit. There were the subtle moments, the way partners never made eye contact when handing her assignments, how her ideas were always good but premature, and how younger white assistants were promoted above her within months. But Charlene endured it all. She had worked too hard, climbed too far. She wasn't going to give them an excuse to cut her loose. Then came the hiring spreadsheet. She hadn't meant to find it. She was organizing files for an audit when she clicked open a folder titled Diversity Planning. Inside was an internal document, a list of candidates, resumes, notes, and a final column labeled Risk. Next to every black applicant's name, that column was marked High. She blinked, read it again. Every black candidate marked high risk. Every white candidate marked fit or recommended. It wasn't a suggestion. It was policy. Her chest had tightened in disbelief. She scrolled to the bottom of the spreadsheet and found a comment from a senior partner. "Charlene's pushing too hard on equity. Smart enough to make trouble, not enough to matter." She had stared at the screen for a long time that night. Not because she was surprised, because she had always suspected, but because the cruelty had been laid bare in writing. She could have deleted it. She could have stayed silent. Instead, she printed the file, walked it to HR, laid it on the desk with trembling hands. They had thanked her for bringing it forward, told her an internal investigation would begin, assured her the firm took bias seriously. 3 weeks later, her position was restructured. 2 months after that, Her name was quietly blacklisted from the Atlanta legal scene. No firm returned her calls. No interview led to a second. She applied for jobs that matched her experience and never heard back. Eventually, her savings evaporated. She sold her car, took temp work, and one day, after failing to land a job at a smaller firm, she filled out a cleaning services application under the name Charlene A. Davis. Left her paralegal experience off the resume entirely. She said she was looking for work stability. And someone finally said yes. It was supposed to be temporary. But temporary turned into a year. Then 3. Then 8. At Evercast Inc., she cleaned the fingerprints off conference tables where she once would have debated contract law. She scrubbed toilets used by men who'd probably lose a case to her in court. She folded towels for women who barely acknowledged her presence in the hallway. But she remembered everything. Every term. Every pattern. Every form of erasure that came dressed as policy. And now the same rot had surfaced again. Different tower. Same disease. Still sitting on the bed, Charlene reached for the manila envelope tucked beneath her mattress. Inside were the artifacts of her old life. A copy of her Worthen and Cole termination letter, her paralegal certification, a few commendation letters, and at the very bottom, a dog-eared printed page. It was a partial PDF of that hiring spreadsheet. The one that ended her career. She'd kept it all these years, not because she thought it would vindicate her, but because it reminded her she wasn't crazy. She had seen what she saw. Just like now. Her phone buzzed again. No new message. Just the earlier email. Still sitting unread in her inbox, like a bomb with a whisper for a timer. Don't stop asking questions. Charlene stood and walked to her kitchen. Poured herself coffee. Her hands were steady, but her mind was racing. Who was Black Eye Knight? She opened her laptop and went searching. Most mentions of the handle had been scrubbed. Forum posts deactivated. Comments deleted. But a few breadcrumbs remained. One post on a now-archived subforum discussed a mysterious SEC leak from years ago. Someone had uploaded evidence of racial discrimination and stock manipulation inside a hedge fund. The evidence had disappeared, but a name lingered in whispers. Black Eye Knight. Further down the thread was a cryptic comment. Burying truth under SEC filings is easy. Until someone who knows where to look comes back. Charlene read it again. Then again. There was one more link at the bottom. A redacted SEC enforcement file. Most of the names had been blacked out, but the submission number wasn't. She copied it. Opened a backdoor legal database she still had access to through an old student login. Typed it in. A file popped up. Archived. Hidden from search. But there. Internal whistleblower complaint. Filed by redacted. Alias Black Eye Knight. Allegation. False asset declaration. Fraudulent diversity metrics. Racialized hiring policies across financial institutions. Status closed. Insufficient documentation. But in the corner, a signature timestamp appeared. And right next to it, hidden in the metadata, was a set of initials WG. Charlene paused. She didn't know what she was expecting. But initials were better than nothing. WG. That was something to work with. She sat back, stunned. Black Eye 99 had been here long before her. Fighting the same monster. Losing the same battles. But still watching. Still fighting. Still whispering back. And now he had chosen her. Suddenly, Charlene's laptop flickered. Just once. A soft glitch. A single black frame. And then an auto log-off prompt appeared. Her access was being revoked. She stared in disbelief. Her student login dormant for years had suddenly been locked out. Someone had traced the submission ID. Someone was watching. And someone didn't want her following the initials any further. Charlene's eyes darted to her phone. The address still glowed on her screen. 709, Wren Street. Storage Unit 47. Noon. Alone. She whispered to herself, more a prayer than a promise.
This time, I'm not backing down.
Charlene decodes the alias Black Eye 99. It links to a whistleblower buried deep in SEC files. In the boardroom, the signature had felt like the end of a conquest. Cameras clicked, executives smiled, and press releases were drafted with confident headlines, like Evercast secures future with historic merger. Trent Marshall stood at the center of it all, bathing in glory, shaking hands with the performative grace of a man used to winning. But only 36 hours later, that world began to split, quietly, then violently. The first tremor came from a tech finance blog out of New York. It was buried at first, just a 4-paragraph post questioning the legitimacy of Cylindrex systems. The author claimed that the company's listed office in Palo Alto didn't exist anymore, that it had been replaced by a vape store. The next morning, a major business news outlet picked up the same thread. Then came the tweets. Breaking. Did Evercast just sign a deal with a ghost company? CEO Trent Marshall, under scrutiny, after contract shows mismatched financials. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Trent stared at the television in his private office, the news anchor's voice droning like static in his ears. And while the company claims the deal remains intact, new questions are being raised about the authenticity of Solintrex's holdings. Financial watchdogs have noted that he muted it. Kara Sullivan, his assistant, stood across from him, pale and visibly shaken. We need to draft a response. Trent didn't look at her. He was still gripping his phone, where shareholders were already flooding his inbox with fury disguised as formality. Ghost company? They really used that term, he said bitterly. Kara nodded. Multiple outlets. He turned, slow and controlled. Find out who leaked this. Find out how deep it's gotten. I already checked, she replied. Legal is saying someone's flagged the name Soltex Corp in the metadata. Some anonymous forum linked it to a prior SEC complaint. And she hesitated. Trent narrowed his eyes. And there's talk that someone inside warned us before the signature. His jaw clenched. Who? She swallowed hard. They think it might have been the Maid. Elsewhere, Charlene walked Evercast's 38th floor with the same silent poise she always had. On the surface, nothing had changed. She wore her uniform. She pushed her cart. She cleaned up the crumbs of people who pretended she didn't exist. But under the surface, her mind burned with precision. She'd seen the headlines, read every word, saved every tweet. She hadn't said a thing, not to the press, not to the other staff, not even to Nyla, but she could feel the building vibrating with unease. People passed her a little faster now, looked over their shoulders when they saw her coming. Some whispered. A few tried too hard to smile. She was still invisible, but now, she was feared. In the executive copy room, tucked in the corner behind a row of printers, she emptied a recycling bin, marked burn after review. It was usually filled with shredded documents, post-it notes, and tossed printouts of presentations, no longer relevant. But today, something caught her eye. A silver glint. Small, easily overlooked. A USB drive. She picked it up casually, folding it into a towel before anyone saw. Her pulse ticked faster. She placed it beneath the mop cart's bottom drawer, and continued her shift like nothing had happened. Trent paced in his office like a man unspooling. The media storm was growing teeth. Legal advisors were now reassessing the risk. Investors were demanding emergency meetings. Worse, one internal audit team member had flagged the exact issue Charlene had spotted, a swapped contract with altered routing instructions. And now the company's biggest vulnerability wasn't the shell company. It was the idea that someone inside had seen it coming. By noon, Evercast stock had dipped 7%. Board members were calling in from across the country, demanding answers. One of them, Robert Haynes, an old-school investor from Boston, didn't mince words during a virtual call. You're telling me you signed a $100 million deal with a company that doesn't exist? Trent kept his voice measured. It was a clerical error, a versioning mix-up. And what about the rumors someone raised a red flag beforehand? We're investigating. A low-level service worker may have misunderstood what they saw. Haynes's eyebrows shot up. A maid? Trent gave a practiced nod. She's not trained in legal documents. It's being handled. The call ended with icy silence. Back in her modest apartment, Charlene plugged the USB drive into an old laptop, one she hadn't used in years, but kept offline for security. She turned off her Wi-Fi, closed the blinds, and locked the door. At first, nothing happened. Just two folders, slides, drafts. She clicked through. Inside were presentation decks, early versions of the merger pitch, but some of them contained raw commentary, left in the margins. Notes like, swap final pages for salvage version. Routing confirmed, Caymans. Burn after signature. Assume Maid knows nothing. If pushback, frame as internal noise. Charlene stared at the screen, her breath slowing. They hadn't just made a mistake. They had built the fraud, deliberately. And they had accounted for her. Not as a person, not even as a witness, but as internal noise. Unexpectedly, her phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown number. You found the drive. Good. But that's not the only one. Look under floor 41's old server room. The wall panel behind the third rack. Black eye now. Her fingers hovered over the screen. A second USB. She knew that server room. It hadn't been used since Evercast upgraded their cloud system 2 years ago. But it was still there, cold, forgotten, unmonitored. Her pulse began to race again. If there was more, then she wasn't just a witness. She was a threat. At that very moment, in another corner of the building, Kara Sullivan sat at her desk staring at her screen. An internal memo had just landed in her inbox, sent by someone anonymous. It was a screenshot, a photo. Charlene, standing in the boardroom, blurred but identifiable, her eyes fixed on the contract, her lips moved. The subject line read, she warned him. You know it. Clean this up. Kara's hand trembled as she deleted the email, but not before saving the image to a private folder, because she knew the truth now. And deep down, a part of her wasn't sure she wanted to protect Trent anymore. Outside, rain began to fall. Inside, Evercast's foundation was quietly starting to rot. And beneath the polished surface, a woman they had dismissed as harmless had just found a key they never meant to leave behind. Charlene discovers a hidden USB in a recycling bin, marked burn after review. Charlene's living room was silent, save for the low hum of her old Dell laptop. A weathered machine with faded keys and a cracked hinge that only opened at a precise angle. She sat cross-legged on the floor, a notepad beside her. The USB drive she had found in Evercast's recycling bin, now plugged in and pulsing faint blue. The blinds were drawn. Her phone was silenced. The world outside moved obliviously. But in this room, everything had stopped. She had been in corporate America before. She knew the language of strategy, of cold dismissals, of plausible deniability. But what she saw in those files didn't use euphemisms. They didn't mask their intentions. They didn't hide their racism. The USB contained 4 folders. Each was dated and tagged with internal code names. The first folder, Operation Eclipse, held the initial pitch decks of the merger, with alternate slides Charlene hadn't seen during public presentations. These versions referred not to Sol and Trek systems, but to Project Darkroom. At first, she thought it was tech jargon. Then she opened the attached emails. If we route it through Darkroom, one executive wrote, we control the exposure. Let's keep the real numbers hidden until exit. Another replied, perfect. Nobody outside legal or the dustpans will see the switch. Charlene froze. Dustpans. She knew code when she saw it. Her stomach turned as she read more. A third message came from a senior VP. She walked past the conference table again. Gave me a look. Think she suspects? The response chilled her. Dustpans don't read contracts. They read labels on bleach bottles. And finally, the one that made her entire body go cold. She won't know the difference between a mop and a million. Charlene's breath hitched. She sat back, blinking hard. They had planned the fraud. But more than that, they had dehumanized her in the process. Reduced her to a racialized code word. Dustpan. The tool that gets shoved into the corner, used, ignored, and discarded. It wasn't just corporate arrogance. It was layered cruelty, systemic, deliberate, and venomous. She clicked deeper into the folder marked legal sandbags. There were draft documents labeled preemptive PR strategy, already written in case of fallout. One draft read, we were misled by external consultants. A lower-level service worker was unfortunately confused and caused initial disruption. Another one, even colder. In cases of internal misinformation, we reserve the right to pursue damages if sensitive information is disclosed publicly. We are aware of a potential breach and are investigating the party responsible. Charlene gritted her teeth. They were going to blame her. Again, just like Worthen and Cole. But there was more. The final folder, named Payout Ladder, listed names and payout amounts. It detailed which executives were receiving bonuses once the deal closed with the fraud baked in. Trent Marshall, 14. Kara Sullivan, 4.
Ross Warren, 6.8 million.
Contract admin sweep, unnamed shell, 3. Buried in that spreadsheet was an Excel note in the margins. Once done, wipe internal drives, destroy printed drafts, keep dustpans silent until exit strategy is secured. She sat perfectly still. In her lap were the pieces of a corporate crime, documents that, if released, wouldn't just bring shame, they would bring down Evercast itself. She stared at the screen, then opened her encrypted mail, and started composing a new message. She didn't include a subject. She didn't explain who she was. She simply attached the files and typed 4 words. You were right. Then she sent it to the only contact that mattered now. Black Eye 90. She stared at her screen, unsure what would happen next. It didn't take long. Exactly 5 minutes later, a reply arrived. No body, no explanation. Just an address. 709 Wren Street. Her blood ran cold. The same address from the earlier message. This time, no instructions. No time. No threats. Just confirmation. Charlene leaned back, heart pounding. The evidence she held wasn't just damning. It was comprehensive. It told a story of theft, of racism woven into policy, of a system built on the belief that black bodies like hers wouldn't understand, wouldn't fight, wouldn't matter. And now she had the power to prove them wrong. But across town, inside the gleaming Evercast tower, Trent's office was no longer the throne room it used to be. He paced like a man unraveling at the edges. On his desk were 5 phones, 2 personal, 3 company-issued, each buzzed with notifications from lawyers, investors, and crisis teams. Kara stood in the corner, arms folded tight across her chest, her face drained of color. "They found the drafts," she said quietly. "Not all of them, but enough." Trent didn't answer. "I told you not to save them on that drive." He spun around. "Don't start." She stepped forward, her voice trembling but defiant. "You called her a dustpan." Trent's eyes narrowed. She was a maid. Kara didn't flinch. She was right. Silence cracked the room. He stared at her. "You want to flip on me now?" "No," she said quietly. "I want to survive this." At that same moment, Charlene sat back from her laptop, staring at the darkened screen. Her eyes burned, her muscles ached, but inside her chest, a new force began to rise. Not anger, not even vengeance. Certainty. They had underestimated her. Twice. And this time she had them cornered. The USB had been left for dead, marked burn after review, tossed like trash. But it carried everything. Every joke, every code, every dollar routed through a lie. She reached for her phone, dialed Nyla's number, but didn't hit send. She wanted to hear her daughter's voice, wanted to tell her what she was doing. But not yet. This wasn't done. The light from the laptop dimmed to black. Charlene stood and walked to the window. Outside, the city was quiet, but it felt like the moment before a tidal wave. Her phone buzzed again. Another email. From unknown at securemail. Subject. Now you're ready. Body, you've got the truth. But if you want the whole picture, come to Wren Street. Bring the drive. Bring your past. There was one last line. Some lies are bigger than one company. Charlene's hand closed around the USB drive. She no longer felt invisible. She felt dangerous. Charlene forwards the files to Black Eye 99, who replies with a single address. 709 Wren Street. The morning air clung to Charlene's skin, like wet cloth, as she stepped out of her car in Atlanta's industrial district, where time seemed to have stopped somewhere around night. Rusted warehouses leaned against each other like wounded boxers, windows either busted out or boarded shut, paint peeled like scabs from metal siding, and silence stretched across the cracked asphalt, broken only by the occasional groan of distant machinery. The address 709 Wren Street was etched onto a faded blue mailbox that leaned sideways on its post, like it was too tired to stand anymore. The building behind it looked less like a house and more like a forgotten relic of fire and smoke. The roof sagged in the middle, blackened with old scorch marks. One half of the house had clearly survived a blaze, the other had not. Charlene hesitated at the curb, fingers wrapped tightly around her tote bag. Inside was the USB drive, the one she'd recovered from Evercast's waste, and a printed summary of the most damning files. She'd come alone, just as instructed. She hadn't told Nyla, hadn't even left a note. Whatever waited inside that house was something she had to face first before the world saw it. She walked to the door and knocked twice. Nothing. She raised her hand to knock again, but the door opened silently on the second try. Inside, the house was dim. Dust hung in shafts of light, cutting through a cracked window pane. The scent of burned wood lingered beneath the stronger smells of old paper, dry ink, and stale coffee. Then she heard him. "You can close the door. If someone's watching, they already know you're here." The voice came from a corner of the room, where a man sat hunched over a long, cluttered desk. Papers were stacked in organized chaos, each one marked, dated, highlighted. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, casting a yellow hue over the man's silver beard and sunken eyes. Charlene stepped forward slowly.
You're...
He didn't look up. "Walter Green." He reached for a coffee mug, sipped, and then motioned toward a chair across from him. And you're the maid they didn't think could read. Charlene's chest tightened. He finally looked up. Sit, he said, softer now. They tried to erase you too? She didn't answer at first. Her legs moved on instinct as she lowered herself into the creaking metal chair. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Two strangers, decades apart in age, bound by something deeper than words. Walter spoke again, voice even. I know who you are. I've known since the moment you sent the files. The system always underestimates people like us, especially when we show up quiet, black and uninvited. Charlene studied him, his face worn from years of battles, most of them likely lost. His hands were covered in faded ink stains. He looked like someone who had fought too long and refused to stop. You're Black Eye 99? She asked. No, he said plainly. But I mentored him, fed him everything I couldn't publish myself, until they shut him down. Charlene blinked. So he's… Walter shook his head. Gone. Disappeared in 2019. Digital footprints erased. His last message to me was, they've started cleaning house. If I vanish, make sure someone else learns the map. He gestured around the room. This is the map. Charlene opened her bag and slid the USB across the table. I found this in a recycling bin, marked burn after review. Everything's on it. Emails, slurs and code, payout plans, PR damage control. Walter inserted the drive into a battered laptop, the casing held together by tape. Within seconds, his face changed. Not with surprise, but confirmation. They're using the same format, he muttered. Same document tree. Same labeling structure. Hell, they didn't even bother updating their shell routing pattern. Just renamed the ghost company and kept the model. You've seen this before? Charlene asked. Walter didn't look up. Evercast isn't new at this. They just got cocky. He stood up suddenly and walked toward the back of the room, then pulled back an old bookcase revealing a reinforced steel door with a keypad lock. After punching in a code, he pulled the door open, revealing a hidden vault room, walls lined with boxes, files and old server drives. Some labels were handwritten, some stamped, most bore dust so thick it looked like ash. Charlene stepped inside behind him, breath caught in her throat. This, Walter said, is what they've spent decades hiding. He pulled out a folder labeled Lisa Monroe 2011, Internal Disappearance, and handed it to Charlene. Inside were pages of notes, photos, copies of employee records, and the worst of it all, handwritten meeting minutes from a risk committee within Evercast. One line was circled in red. If she pushes again, escalate the exit protocol. Charlene's voice barely worked. Who was she? A janitor. Black woman. Just like you. She flagged money transfers that didn't line up. Told HR. HR told legal. Legal made her vanish. Charlene felt the air thicken. Walter continued. No media. No police. No records. They erased her like a typo. Her daughter tried to raise questions, got shut down by legal threats, and sealed settlements. Charlene flipped the last page and found a photo of Lisa. Short afro. Warm eyes. A badge clipped to her chest. It read, Evercast Facilities. Floor. I work on floor 41. Charlene whispered. Walter nodded. So did she. He walked to another corner and pulled out a sealed envelope.
This one's new.
I was waiting for someone like you to show up. Someone with fire and nothing left to lose. Charlene took the envelope and opened it. Inside were names, some familiar, some not. Board members. Assistant VPs. 2 corporate lawyers. At the bottom, Trent Marshall. Next to his name, a string of numbers. What's this? She asked. His Cayman account. She stared at him. They already moved the first $4 million. It's not about the merger, Charlene. It's about walking away clean, while people like you take the fall. Charlene clenched her jaw. Not this time. Walter's voice was low but charged. You still have a choice. You can take this, leak it, walk away, and they'll eventually recover. Or you dig deeper, risk more, and expose what they've done to people like you, before you. Charlene met his eyes. What would you do? He smiled grimly. I already did. That's why I live in a burned-out house with no pension. Charlene looked around the room again, at the shelves of pain, at the evidence buried in heat and silence, and she made her decision. She turned back to him. I'm going deeper. Walter's eyes lit for a moment. Then, without speaking, he walked back to the vault and opened a final drawer. From it, he pulled an external hard drive and set it on the table. This is the timeline. A decade of buried cases. And every single one traces back to Evercast. He paused. And to Trent. Charlene reached for it. But before her hand touched the drive, Walter said one more thing. Just know if you carry this out of here, you're not invisible anymore. Charlene looked up. Her voice was steady. Good. He opens a vault of documents, proving Evercast has done this before. The room smelled like time. Dust, ink, and the cold scent of buried truth hung heavy in the air as Charlene stood alone in the center of Walter's vault room. The box labeled Lisa Monroe, 2011, internal disappearance sat open beside her. The documents had aged, their edges curled and yellowing, but the weight of their contents was as sharp as ever. Her eyes were fixed on the photo of a woman who looked like someone she might have passed in the hallway on any ordinary day. Brown eyes, tired smile, name badge clipped to a plain gray uniform. Evercast facility staff. It could have been Charlene's face. It could have been any black woman who worked the floors they weren't invited to walk freely. Walter watched her from the other side of the vault's threshold, leaning on the metal doorframe, his voice low. I met Lisa when she came to the accounting building I worked in. She didn't have fancy words. She didn't even know what she was looking at. But she had this spreadsheet, one she pulled out of the trash. Said the numbers didn't match the announcements Evercast made at the time. Charlene didn't move. Walter continued. She was scared. Not for herself, for her daughter. Said she didn't trust anyone in her building. But she thought maybe someone on the outside would understand. Charlene whispered. What did you do? I took the sheet. Ran it against public filings. She was right. There were millions missing. Diverted from community contracts Evercast had promised to sponsor. And I took it to an old contact in the media. They asked for proof of identity. He sighed. I gave them her name. Charlene slowly turned toward him. You exposed her. Walter nodded with the weight of a decade behind it. She told me to. Said it was worth it if her daughter could live in a city where they didn't bury the truth. The story played out slowly, cruelly. Lisa Monroe filed an anonymous tip to a local watchdog blog. A few days later, she vanished. No police report, no media follow-up. Just a quiet disappearance brushed under the chaos of an Atlanta winter storm. She never came home. Walter searched for her, at first in newsrooms, then in court filings, but nothing came up. Her badge number no longer existed in Evercast's internal HR portal. The year-end employee records showed no listing for a Monroe. Even her building access logs had been scrubbed. Lisa had been erased, digitally, professionally, and literally. I tried to take it public, Walter said. But by then they'd already labeled me a conspiracy nut. Retired. Black. Angry. Easy to ignore. He looked at Charlene. No one believed me. Until you. Charlene turned back to the folder. Inside was a printed copy of an internal memo, dated December. Subject: potential leak from janitorial staff. Resolve ASAP. If story reaches press, escalate to legal tier 3. Remove physical traces. There was no signature. Just a set of initials. T. Trent Marshall. Even back then, he had been climbing. Even back then, he had blood on his ambition. Charlene followed Walter down a narrow hall leading deeper into the back of the vault, where water damage stained the corners of the concrete ceiling, and the temperature dropped by several degrees. He stopped beside a tall, rusted metal locker and slid a key into its padlock. You ready? He asked. She nodded once. He opened the door. Inside, hanging from a wire hook, was a faded gray Evercast uniform. The collar bore the initials LM sewn in faint blue thread. It was identical to the uniform Charlene wore every day, except this one hadn't been washed in years. And it was stained. Dark brown spots blotted the sleeves, and the hem, faded, but unmistakable. Charlene stepped closer, hand trembling. Is that? Yes, Walter said. Blood. She recoiled slightly, then forced herself forward. She touched the stiff fabric with her fingertips. What happened to her? She whispered.
No one knows.
But she was last seen walking out of Evercast's service elevator, around 11:47 p.m. that night. There's no footage after that. The building's records show a power maintenance outage, the same night. Walter's voice dropped further. My guess? They made her walk into a trap. Charlene's hand tightened around the collar. She looked at Walter, And now I'm the next one. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Later, back in the main room, Charlene laid the uniform across a long metal table and stared at it in silence. It was more than fabric, more than evidence. It was a message. They'd done this before, and unless someone shattered the cycle, they would do it again. She pulled her own uniform from her bag and laid it beside Lisa's. Same cut, same color, same stitching. One soaked in silence, one still breathing. She pulled out her notebook and began copying down everything Walter had shown her. She didn't take the originals. He insisted they never leave the vault. But he gave her scans, passwords, a burner drive with redacted witness testimony he'd collected from 2 other women who'd once worked at Evercast and fled when things got weird. One of the statements read, "We weren't cleaning floors. We were cleaning lies." Charlene paused at that line. "Let it settle. You can walk away," Walter said. "You've got enough. Just leak what you have, go public, and start over." Charlene shook her head. "Lisa didn't get to start over. Neither did you." She looked at him. "I want the whole thing." Walter exhaled deeply. "Then you need the other name." Charlene furrowed her brow. "What name?" He pulled open a drawer and handed her a folded paper. Written in shaky handwriting was a list. At the bottom, Kara Sullivan. Charlene blinked. "His assistant?" Walter nodded slowly. "She was around in 2011. Different role. Quiet. Always in the room." Charlene's breath caught. "She's not just a bystander," Walter said. "She's a thread, and if you pull her right, the whole thing unravels." Charlene stood. The air felt heavier now, but she was standing straighter than she had in days. She folded the paper and slipped it into her coat. Before she left, she looked back at the blood-stained uniform one last time. "Not again," she whispered, and walked into the light. Charlene finds Lisa's Evercast uniform, with bloodstains. Charlene didn't sleep that night. Her apartment was cloaked in silence, but her mind buzzed like a live wire. On her kitchen table, printouts from Walter's vault were spread like a crime scene, highlighted, labeled, cross-referenced. She knew the evidence was explosive. The question was how much to release, how much would make people listen without getting her erased like Lisa. In the end, she chose precision over volume. She uploaded 3 specific PDFs to an encrypted Dropbox: the internal Evercast email, where the term dustpan was used, the payout ladder showing Trent's bonus, and the memo referencing legal tier 3 against janitorial staff. She didn't attach her name. She created a burner handle, Echo Dust, and sent the link to 5 contacts from Walter's digital network, anonymous tip lines, former watchdogs, a professor-turned-blogger who specialized in corporate racism. She didn't expect it to hit fast, but by 10 a.m. the next morning, it exploded. Internal emails reveal racist slur codes in Evercast merger documents. Dustpan, darkroom, and the $100 question: who is Evercast really merging with? Insiders claim Maid raised alarm before signature, then vanished. The headlines started small, then grew teeth. Newsrooms scrambled to trace the source. Investigative reporters flooded Evercast's PR inbox. Twitter threads dissected the meaning of dustpan, with fury and disbelief. One viral post read, "They codenamed the company after darkness, and the maid after a mop. This ain't just fraud. This is systemic racism on corporate letterhead." Charlene watched it unfold from her sofa, fingers clenched around a chipped coffee mug. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. The flood hadn't come yet, but the rain had started. But Evercast had its own storm plan. By noon, their legal team fired back with an official statement. "We are investigating the authenticity of the leaked documents. We believe this is a targeted attack intended to harm the reputation of our diverse and forward-thinking workplace." Then came the dagger. The anonymous leaker appears to be a disgruntled service worker with a record of civil unrest, including a protest arrest in 2015. "We caution the public against jumping to conclusions." Charlene's breath caught. They found it. Her old arrest, the one from a protest outside the Worthen and Cole building, when she had stood silently with a cardboard sign, reading "Black labor built this, white power owns it." She hadn't even shouted, but police said she obstructed a driveway. The charge was dropped, but the booking remained. The next segment on national cable was a gut punch. A polished anchor sat behind a sleek desk, reading from a teleprompter like a surgeon with a scalpel. "Tonight, we turn to the shadowy allegations against tech giant Evercast. While social media buzzes over documents alleging coded racism, sources tell us the whistleblower may be an unstable former employee, previously arrested, possibly acting out of revenge. He smirked lightly. One has to wonder, is this about justice or just a payout? Charlene stared at the screen, stunned. Her own face, blurred but recognizable, flashed behind him. Her eyes in the photo were sharp, determined. They had captured the moment she whispered in the boardroom, but the caption read, "Unidentified disgruntled worker." She turned off the TV. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from something darker, something hotter, rage. Her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. No caller ID. She stared at it for a second too long, then answered. "Hello?" The voice was soft, familiar in a way that didn't make sense. "Charlene," it said. "This is Black Eye Night." She sat upright. You thought I was gone. I let them think that. Safer that way. But I've been watching. Listen." Charlene's mouth was dry. "They're turning it on me. I knew they would. But this, they're rewriting the story in real time. They always do," he said. "That's why you need to speak in a room they don't control." Silent. Then he added, "There's a podcast, Underground, Off-Grid, hosted by a black journalist who got blackballed after exposing police cover-ups in Baltimore. She runs it out of her basement now. Invite only. Raw. Unedited. She wants to hear from you." Charlene blinked. "I'm not a speaker. I'm not a—" "Yes, you are," he cut in. "You've already said the most important sentence of the decade. That's the wrong contract. Now it's time to say the rest." Charlene stared at the wall, heart racing. "Where? I'll text you the location. One rule, no scripts, just truth." The line went dead. Later that evening, her phone buzzed again. A message. One line. "Tomorrow, 8 p.m. Come alone. No phones. Bring truth." Attached was a location, a warehouse address just outside the city. She closed her eyes, breathed in deep. This wasn't part of the plan, but maybe that was the point. Plans got erased. Truth didn't. Across town, Evercast's boardroom had shifted into crisis mode. Trent sat at the head of the table, suit jacket off, tie loose, face flushed with fury. The PR director read the latest social sentiment report aloud. Negative mentions up 230%. Hashtags include "Maid was right," "Dustpan Gate," and "Expose Evercast." "Kill the hashtags," Trent barked. "We can't," she said. "They're everywhere. Even athletes are tweeting about it." Ross Warren, one of the VPs, leaned forward. "Maybe it's time to name her. Get in front of it." Kara flinched. "Name her? That's dangerous." Trent shot her a look. "Dangerous is what she's already doing." He pulled a file from his briefcase and slid it across the table. Charlene's HR folder expanded. Fabricated write-ups, incidents that never happened, warnings never given. Ross looked through it. This'll do it. One leak, and she loses public sympathy, overnight. Kara stayed silent, because she recognized the playbook. And this time she wasn't sure she could stomach watching it work again. Back in her apartment, Charlene prepared. She didn't pack a bag, didn't wear makeup. She chose the same uniform she always wore, the one they mocked, ignored, and tried to erase her in. And as she zipped it up, she looked in the mirror and whispered, "Unstable, huh?" Her voice was steady. She opened a small wooden box in her closet, one she hadn't touched in years. Inside was her paralegal certification, creased from being folded too long. A photo of her and Nyla at graduation, and a tiny note from her mother that read, "The world won't see you until you make it look." She slipped the note into her pocket. Time to make them look. Across the country, on a podcast platform barely held together by donations, a countdown clock appeared. Live in 24 hours. The Maid Who Spoke. The host had only one sentence in the episode teaser. They tried to silence a woman who cleaned their messes. Turns out she was cleaning their crimes. And then, tomorrow night she tells you everything. Black Eye 99 offers to get her on a secret podcast hosted by a black former journalist. The warehouse smelled like old paint and rebellion. Industrial piping lined the ceiling like arteries, rusted but alive, carrying the weight of secrets that didn't belong in polished boardrooms. Charlene stood in the center of the makeshift studio, surrounded by concrete silence and low voltage. The air was dry, but her palms were damp. Her heart beat faster than she wanted to admit. Opposite her sat Jada Hill, former investigative reporter turned underground podcast host. She had been blackballed years ago after refusing to bury a story about police corruption. Now she ran the unheard, A podcast that served as an unfiltered space for truth-tellers no one else dared to platform. No cameras, no edits, just a mic, a story, and a signal that reached deep into communities desperate to be believed. Jada didn't ask for notes, didn't prep her with questions. She just gave Charlene a glass of water, offered a single nod, and leaned into the mic. "You ready?" Charlene wasn't. But she answered, "Yes," and the red light blinked on. The world didn't know her name yet. She was still just a source in headlines, a whispered figure in trending hashtags. But in that warehouse, under dim lights and surrounded by cement walls, Charlene began to speak not as an anonymous leaker, but as a woman who had watched history write over her again and again. "My name is Charlene Davis," she began, her voice tight but clear. "I cleaned floors at Evercast for 8 years. I was invisible the whole time, until I saw something they didn't want anyone to see." She spoke slowly at first, like a person still deciding whether she had the right to take up this much space. Then it came faster. She told them about the boardroom, the signature, the folder swap, the fake company. She spoke of the term dustpan buried in emails, of the staged erasure, the binder labeled Stage 2, blame her, and of Lisa Monroe, the woman whose body never turned up but whose blood had never stopped screaming. Charlene's hands shook as she talked. Her fingers twisted the hem of her sweater until the fabric stretched. "They thought I'd be quiet forever," she said, voice breaking. "They thought I didn't matter, that my name wasn't worth remembering, that my words weren't worth hearing." Jada sat still, not interrupting, not moving. Charlene wiped her eyes. "They don't see us when we mop their floors, but we see everything. And now I'm speaking not just for me, for every black woman they've buried in silence, with paperwork and smiles." The podcast aired at exactly 8. No intro music, no ad breaks, just truth. By 8:09 p.m., the platform's servers were straining under demand. By 8:30, clips were being sliced and re-uploaded on TikTok, Twitter, YouTube. Her voice, cracking, trembling but undeniable, was now everywhere. "They called me dustpan. I call that a confession."
"You're scared of what I saw? Good, because I'm not done looking."
I warned him. He signed it anyway. That ink was blood. Within an hour, it became the most downloaded podcast episode in the show's history. By midnight, it had 2.3 million plays. By sunrise, over 4 million. The internet erupted. Hashtags flooded the timeline. Dustpan truth. Charlene was right. Say her name, Lisa Monroe. Not just a maid. Journalists began piecing together what their sanitized sources had ignored. Social media sleuths found footage of Lisa Monroe at Evercast holiday parties from 20. Others posted comparisons between Charlene's voice on the podcast and the blurred figure in the viral boardroom photo. One woman tweeted, "She's not a maid. She's a mirror. And they don't like what they see." Protests ignited the next morning. At first, it was just a dozen people outside Evercast's glass tower. Mostly women, mostly workers, carrying handwritten signs, but by noon it was hundreds.
And by dusk, thousands.
The signs read, "We are dustpans, and we're watching. 100 years fraud built on silence." She cleaned the mess, then cleaned the lie. Employees inside Evercast began to panic. Janitorial staff stopped showing up. Temp workers refused to cross picket lines. Food delivery services canceled all contracts citing risk concerns. The company's operations slowed, and so did its silence. Inside Evercast's boardroom, tension frayed at the seams. The walls were too quiet. Eyes darted instead of holding. Trent Marshall stood at the center, jaw tight, pacing. Ross Warren leaned against the window with his arms crossed. Kara Sullivan sat stiffly, barely blinking. "We need to counter," Trent said. "We need control. Right now we're letting a woman with no credentials drive the public narrative." "Because she's telling the truth," Kara said flatly. Trent's eyes narrowed. "You're slipping." "No," she shot back. "I'm waking up." Ross broke the tension. "We go forward with the blame her plan." Trent hesitated, then nodded. "I want her history leaked tonight. Police records, ex-employer notes, everything we buried. Let's remind the public she's unstable." Kara stood suddenly. "You do that and you'll burn with it." He glared at her, but she didn't back down this time. Meanwhile, Charlene sat on her apartment floor surrounded by stacks of documents. Her paralegal certification now pinned to the wall beside a framed picture of Lisa Monroe's uniform. Her phone buzzed endlessly. Calls, messages, voicemails. Some hateful, some desperate, Many just quiet words from strangers. You spoke for me. I see you. Thank you. She hadn't planned for this. But maybe the truth didn't need a plan. It just needed a mic. She scrolled through comments until one made her stop. She was just a maid. Underneath it, a reply. Then why does she have the power to make billionaires sweat? The next morning, Evercast's attempt at counterspin collapsed before it began. Just as the PR team finalized a press statement suggesting Charlene was mentally unstable, a board member went rogue. Malcolm Barron, a silver-haired financier with decades of unshakable loyalty to the firm. He wasn't the kind of man who made scenes. He was the kind who smiled through scandal. But this time, something cracked. At a surprise press conference held just outside Evercast's marble lobby, Malcolm took the podium alone. Good afternoon. I was scheduled to defend Evercast today, but I can't. I've seen the documents. I've heard the voice of Charlene Davis, and I'm resigning, effective immediately. Reporters gasped. Malcolm continued. The term racial fraud might sound strange to some of you, but that's exactly what this is. A company built on extraction, lies, and the silent suffering of black labor. I won't stand by it anymore. And then he left. No Q&A.
No spin.
Just silence and power. Charlene watched the live stream with a stillness that felt sacred. This wasn't absolution. It wasn't even accountability. But it was validation. The kind that couldn't be erased by slurs in emails. Or blood on a uniform. As night fell, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. One line. I need to talk. Tonight. Alone. She paused. The signature read, Case. Charlene stared at the screen. Kara Sullivan, the woman who once helped script her erasure. Now asking for a meeting. In the dark. She replied with a single word. Where? Trent's assistant texted Charlene from a burner phone. I need to talk. Tonight. Alone. The subway station was nearly empty. Just a few stragglers loitering beneath flickering fluorescent lights, their shadows long and tired. The night air carried the weight of exhaust fumes and rain-damp concrete. Charlene stepped off the platform and followed the narrow staircase into the underground parking lot, where the city's noise dimmed into a low, vibrating hum. She walked slowly, scanning each corner, each vehicle, her nerves taut. She hadn't told anyone she was coming, not even Walter. The text had said alone. That word had curled in her gut for hours. But she came anyway. In the far corner of the lot, just beyond the broken ticket machine, stood Kara Sullivan. Charlene's first thought was how ordinary she looked without the heels. The pressed blouses, the Evercast badge. She wore a gray hoodie, jeans, and a ball cap pulled low over her brow. But her eyes gave her away. Wide, twitchy, scared, or guilty, or both. Charlene stopped 10 feet away. You said you wanted to talk, she said, her voice steady. Kara nodded once, then motioned her closer. They sat on the low cement ledge near an unused stairwell. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Kara exhaled.
I've watched you for years, you know?
Charlene raised an eyebrow. You were always quiet, efficient, invisible. Charlene didn't flinch. That's the idea. Kara gave a humorless chuckle. We counted on that. Charlene turned her head slowly. Count. And then Kara whispered the sentence that tore through the silence like a scalpel. We used you. Your silence, your sweat, your shadow. Charlene didn't move. But her breath caught. Kara didn't look at her. She looked past her, into the dark. You cleaned our rooms, delivered our papers, walked past our screens, and we assumed you'd never look close enough to matter. Charlene's voice was cold. But I did. Kara nodded. And you weren't supposed to. You weren't even supposed to be near that boardroom the day he signed. I warned him anyway. And he ignored you. Because we all did. Kara pulled a crumpled pack of tissues from her coat and wiped her eyes. Trent didn't just sign that deal by mistake. He didn't get tricked. He built the mistake. Charlene's hands curled into fists at her sides. Kara continued, her voice quieter now. It wasn't about growing Evercast. It was about crashing it on purpose. Killing the company with a fraudulent deal, so Trent and the others could walk away with parachutes before the stock dropped. Who else? Charlene asked. Ross Warren. Malcolm didn't know until the end. He was brought in late, but Ross and Vincent Ashmore, the legal VP, they were in it from the start. Me too. Charlene's eyes narrowed. Why you? Kara swallowed hard. Because I'm not rich. Not born into it. My student loans are older than my car. Trent promised us all exits. He said the company was a machine built to extract, and once it served its purpose, we'd cash out and let it die. And everyone else? Collateral. The employees, the janitors, the contractors. You. Charlene's chest tightened, but she kept her face unreadable. We spent 2 years staging it. Kara confessed. We built Solintrex's shell from scratch, registered it offshore, created a fake CTO and submitted fake patents, even mocked up employee reviews. We fed the board what they wanted to hear and blocked dissent. Anyone who raised questions got frozen out. Charlene's voice was sharper now. And Lisa Monroe? Kara looked down. She wasn't supposed to find that routing report. She was supposed to clean, not investigate. I don't know everything about what happened after. Only that legal Tier 3 was activated. That's code for erasure. Charlene's stomach churned. Then, Kara added, they built a contingency. A fail-safe scapegoat. Charlene's mouth went dry. Kara reached into her tote bag and pulled out a black binder. Thick, heavy, sealed with a rubber band. She held it out. Charlene didn't move. What is that? She asked quietly. Kara didn't answer. Just placed it gently beside her and whispered. Stage 2. Blame her. Charlene stared at the words printed across the cover. Inside the binder were documents she never expected to see. Pre-written HR memos accusing her of misconduct. Doctored time cards suggesting she accessed unauthorized areas. Incident reports claiming she made threats to staff. There was even a photo. A blurred still from a security camera. It showed her standing in the boardroom during the signing. Alone. The caption read, Unstable employee intrudes during high-level transaction. Threat level, moderate. She flipped to the next page. A draft press release. It is with deep concern that we disclose a pattern of troubling behavior from a service worker recently terminated for breaching protocol. While we cannot discuss personnel matters in detail, her allegations appear to stem from a long-standing resentment and personal grievances. Charlene's throat tightened. They had scripted her erasure, months in advance. She looked at Kara. Why are you giving me this? Kara's face crumpled. Because I can't carry it anymore. I tried to ignore it, to believe it was just numbers. But when you spoke on that podcast, when you said they thought you'd be quiet forever, her voice broke. I heard myself in you, the version of me I'd buried. Charlene stared at her for a long time. You still had a choice. Lisa didn't. I know, Kara whispered. Silence swelled between them, like a chasm. Then Kara added, they're going to release it if the board collapses. It's already scheduled to auto-distribute to press if Trent loses his seat. Charlene's pulse thudded in her ears. They want to ruin you before you ruin them. But it's a lie. Kara gave a hollow laugh. Since when did the truth matter to men like that? Charlene stood slowly, binder in hand. This doesn't scare me, she said, though her voice trembled slightly. It confirms everything I've always known. That they never planned to see me. Only to silence me. Kara wiped her nose with the sleeve of her hoodie. I want to testify, she said suddenly. Charlene turned. What? I want to testify. I'll go public. Say everything. Not anonymously. On the record. They can come for me next, but I won't let them bury you. Charlene stared at her. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't enough. But it was something. As they parted ways beneath the cold glow of a flickering street lamp, Kara paused one last time. You're not who they think you are, Charlene. Charlene didn't look back. I never was. Kara hands Charlene a binder, labeled Stage 2 Blame Her. Charlene sat alone at her kitchen table. The heavy black binder Kara had given her laid open like a confession. It had no cover art, no logos, just sterile documents, carefully formatted with Evercast headers and color-coded tabs. At first glance, it looked like standard HR paperwork, the kind that might fill a file cabinet in any corporate building. But as she flipped through the pages, her stomach began to turn. Every sheet in the binder was a calculated weapon. There were HR complaints, fabricated, all dated and signed. One claimed Charlene had been disruptive and confrontational during her shifts. Another described her lingering in unauthorized areas and refusing to answer management's questions. Each one read like a script rehearsed for maximum credibility, carefully phrased to avoid triggering suspicion from investigators, but enough to imply she was volatile. Charlene stared at one page that included surveillance timestamps, one showing her standing near the boardroom during the day of the merger. It was the same footage she'd already seen, but here the caption under the photo read, Employee placed herself inside a restricted meeting zone, without approval, may have tampered with company property. She whispered. Tampered? Her voice barely carried. These weren't just smears, they were traps. She turned another page. This one was labeled, Internal Risk Mitigation Strategy. Subject, C. Davis. Her name in bold, typed like a liability. Not a person. Below it, bullet points listed tactics. Discredit via behavioral reports. Frame theft of confidential data as motive. Initiate legal cease and desist if she attempts media engagement. Deploy cooperation language in police filing. Highlight previous arrest. Her hands trembled as she reached for the next tab. It was a letter, pre-written and formatted for external release. Charlene Davis was terminated due to ongoing violations of workplace policy. Her recent actions appear to be retaliatory in nature. Evercast respects all employees but must also protect its intellectual property and reputation from individuals acting outside professional conduct. Beneath it, stamped faintly in the footer, drafted Q1, internal only, use if escalated. They'd planned this months ago, long before she ever spoke. But it was the next document that made her chest seize. Titled in bold black letters, Statement to Police. She became violent. Charlene read it 3 times. Every word scorched. On March 3, 2025, Miss Davis appeared increasingly agitated. After being asked to leave the executive floor, she raised her voice, slammed a card against a wall, and began making threatening remarks toward senior staff.
There were quotes attributed to her that she never said.
I'll make sure you all pay. I've seen what you've done. Watch your back. Her eyes blurred with tears. Her lips moved but no sound came out. This wasn't just character assassination. It was preemptive prosecution. They had built a legal box around her. One where her history, her silence, and her race were turned into admissible evidence. Suddenly her phone buzzed. A message. Unknown number. No name. Just 4 words.
They filed it today.
She froze. Another buzz. They're coming tonight. Get out. Her pulse spiked. She rose to her feet, the binder still open on the table. She glanced at the clock. 8:46 p.m. The city outside her window buzzed with Friday night noise. Horns, music, distant laughter. But in here a different kind of clock had started ticking. She opened her phone again and saw a news alert. Evercast officially denounces whistleblower as unstable and hostile. CEO cites internal complaints and safety concerns. Charlene stepped back from the screen like it had physically struck her. She hadn't even read her own statement yet. They had released a narrative of her before she'd been allowed to finish hers. She looked back at the binder. The pages blurred. It wasn't just about tarnishing her name. It was about aligning her identity. Black, poor, overlooked, with a caricature of danger. The angry black woman narrative, one that had justified everything from firing to arrest, to silence. Her breath came faster. They were turning her into the villain in a story she'd spent years trying to escape. She grabbed the binder, zipped it into her backpack, and stuffed her flash drive and Walter's scanned documents inside. Every scrap of truth she owned on her, not in the cloud. Her fingers moved fast but deliberately. She opened her kitchen drawer and pulled out an old prepaid phone, one Walter had given her for emergencies. She powered it on, waited for signal. It lit up with a new message. Police en route. 3 units. Tip filed anonymously. Charlene stood frozen in place. The knock hadn't come yet, but it would. She knew it. In a blur, she killed the lights, grabbed her hoodie, and slid down the back staircase of her apartment building. She didn't wait for the elevator. Didn't text Nyla. Didn't grab her ID. She just ran. Not because she was guilty, but because the world had already been given permission to treat her like she was. Outside, the sirens hadn't started, but she knew they were coming. Her story had gone viral. But now, the machine had started to write its rebuttal, louder, faster, and backed by the badge. And unless she reached someone in time, they'd arrest a maid and frame her as a threat. Charlene realizes the police are already headed to her apartment. Charlene jolted awake to the sound of shattering glass and a chorus of shouted orders. It was just past midnight. Rain pattered on her window. Cold light from police flashlights sliced through the darkness. She gasped as heavy footsteps pounded down her hall. Suddenly, the front door splintered inward. Dozens of masked officers flooded her living room, weapons drawn. SWAT, down on the ground. Now, Charlene scrambled toward her bedroom, shock acting faster than confusion. She didn't resist, she just stood, tears mingling with rain from the window. In a faded bathrobe, The officers handcuffed her with practiced efficiency. Her heart pounded like a drum in her ears. She wanted to scream, wanted to explain, but her voice caught in her throat. Less than 3 minutes later, as the last officer secured the scene, television cameras rounded the corner. News crews with shoulder-mounted cameras and boom mics rushed up the street. Spotlights lit the sky like a performance already in motion. Charlene didn't even realize she had become part of a story. She was escorted down the steps, wet hair plastering her face, her bathrobe clinging to her frame. A civilian recorded from a stoop across the street, phone shaking, tears streaming. A reporter's voice crackled through a speaker. "This is Charlene Davis, the whistleblower Evercast claims was detained for threatening behavior." Charlene saw the headline forming without anyone asking her. Without a trial. Without her voice. Neighbors gathered on the porches. Cameras rolled. One child, barefoot, pajama-covered, recorded from close distance. Her voice lilted out as she pressed her small phone toward Charlene. "Mommy's cleaning lady. She cleaned my house. She gave me cookies." The girl's words echoed over the surrounding silence like a confession of humanity, one that didn't fit the image Evercast had manufactured. Charlene's head turned toward the girl. Her eyes softened, but the handcuffs burned cold. A neighbor toddler's plea became a ripple in a sea of judgment. Inside, Charlene was driven to the precinct in a blacked-out van. The doors slammed shut like finality. The ride was silent. She wondered if someone had called the media tip line first. If the binder had already left the boardroom. They released her into a stark white room, with a metal bench. The mirror was wide, framed in cold aluminum. An officer processed her, took fingerprints, a quick digital photo. She stood in a haze, drenched, bruised in reputation, if not body. She felt the humiliation rise. A slow heat from injustice, turning into fury. Another officer shoved a folder across the desk. Inside were copies of the statement to police documentation Evercast had pre-written, with quotes she never said, incidents she never committed, behavior she never exhibited. She closed her eyes. The burn racket built to frame her. It was underway. She was escorted to a solitary cell, strip-searched, searched through pockets, made to surrender her OTT bright-colored hoodie, to prison-issue gray. The cell door clanged locked. The steel bench was cold. Her hands still stung from handcuffs. She sat on the bunk, clutching her phone in one hand, her old prepaid burner, her remaining lifeline. And then, almost silently, a guard slipped something through the bars of the cell. A folded piece of paper. No envelope. No signature. Just black ink scrawled on white. "Keep quiet, or Lisa's fate will be yours." Charlene's breath hitched. The paper trembled in her hand. Inside the cell, the silence shattered. Charlene pressed the note to her massive crowd, lined the steps of Fulton County Courthouse, by early morning turnout, activists, janitors, legal interns, and everyday people carrying signs. Justice isn't invisible. Charlene's truth is our truth. Civil rights groups, NAACP, ACLU, Southern Justice Alliance, stood at the front, microphones ready, banners stretched taut. The air hummed with anticipation. If the trial had once felt hidden and small, today it felt unavoidable. Charlene entered through a side door, flanked by a team of black attorneys in tailored suits, fierce calm in their eyes. They smiled encouragingly. Inside, the courtroom was packed, media row, witness boxes, and a sea of seats reserved for supporters, whose names weren't listed in any docket. The judge, a woman known for her fair but firm demeanor, took her seat. Her gavel struck. The trial began. First, Walter Green took the stand. He didn't flinch. He told the courtroom about Lisa Monroe, the erased janitor, and Charlene's discovery of the hidden vault, full of documents, spreadsheets, and emails that proved Evercast's pattern of racial corporate fraud. He described how internal memos titled Stage 2 Blame Her had been prepared months ahead. He spoke of the system's intent to erase black voices. He delivered each factual detail without emotion, until the final slide where his hands shook. The court watched, silent, as Charlene nodded. Then Black Eye 99, whose identity remained sealed, appeared via secure video link. His voice was modulated, eyes hidden behind reflection. But his testimony was clear. He confirmed the document's authenticity, traced shell company registrations back to board members, and verified emails using digital metadata no one could forge. Charlene's attorneys submitted everything from Walter's vault and from her own binder. The judge nodded, flipping through highlighted pages full of coded slurs, payout figures, and execution plans. It became stark. This wasn't a misguided contract. It was premeditated corporate racism. When Kara Sullivan took the stand, the entire courtroom shifted. She had come clean on tape, her voice unsteady but real. She spoke of betrayal. She admitted signing documents that framed Charlene, HR complaints, security edits, the police spreadsheet. She confessed to participating actively in the design of the smear campaign, and she testified that Trent resisted denying Charlene's allegations when she threatened to go public. Charlene watched Kara through the plexiglass divider. Kara's eyes held shame, regret, and recognition that she was finally saying the truth. Unfiltered. The prosecution rested on Kara's testimony. The defense stared blankly. Trent's lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Then came Trent himself. He rose slowly. A man used to commanding rooms, but today looked wrecked. His suit was crisp, but sweat darkened his shirt beneath. He spoke with hesitation. "I never meant for this to spiral." He claimed ignorance of the email codes, asserted that terms like dustpan referred to project codenames devoid of racial intent, and insisted that he thought Charlene's warning came from confusion, not clarity. He returned to witness chair and tears brimmed in his eyes. "I signed in good faith," he said. "I believed in innovation. I never wanted anyone hurt." Once Trent had finished, Charlene's lead attorney stood to deliver closing arguments. She held up printouts of secret emails, screenshots where exec files contained the phrase, "She won't know the difference between a mop and a million." She played video from Kara's confession, where Kara whispered, "We used you, your silence, your sweat, your shadow." She showed photos of the blood-stained uniform, Lisa's uniform, side by side with Charlene's identical one. The attorney's voice was unwavering as she addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're not seeking millions of dollars in damages. We're demanding one thing: truth. Truth for Lisa. Truth for Charlene. Truth for every worker made invisible and disposable." The room held its breath. Public interest had turned into pressure. Civil rights groups outside the courthouse spoke to cameras, chanting quietly, "Justice for the dustpans." Legal experts predicted the case could dismantle how corporations framed workers using language, surveillance, and smear campaigns, all while hiding behind colorblind PR statements. Inside, the judge closed the case with a statement that cracked through the tension. "The evidence presented is overwhelming." She paused, uneasily turning toward Trent's side. "This court finds Evercast's leadership engaged in a coordinated scheme to defraud, discredit, and erase black labor, all while presenting a veneer of diversity." A hush followed. Then she leaned forward. "The court will issue a ruling on damages and remedies next week." But just as the gavel lifted to end the session, agents in dark suits entered the courtroom from behind. FBI badges flashed. Lawyers shifted in their seats. The judge stood again. "I've been informed," she said, voice tight, "that federal agents are commencing a full criminal investigation into related financial fraud and civil rights violations." The room gasped. Reporters murmured. Trent froze. Charlene exhaled, her entire body rigid. Outside, the protest erupted with cheers. People chanted, "Truth unveiled." Activists raised fists. Cameras recorded it all. Down on the steps, Kara wiped tears from her eyes. Walter's shoulders sagged with relief. Charlene walked out into the sunlight, lawyers guiding her through the crowd. Reporters shouted questions. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence now carried weight. As she stepped into a waiting car, her phone buzzed. It was a single message, not from a number she recognized. "FBI will need you soon. Be prepared." No name. No number. Charlene looked at the message, then at the courthouse steps behind her. Allies still lingered. Protesters chanted. Journalists flashed lights. She sat back and exhaled. This wasn't over. But she had survived. The judge rules, but the FBI steps in with new charges. They came at dawn. FBI agents in dark suits descended on Evercast's gleaming glass tower and dozens of affiliated offices across the city. The first raid broke open downtown with armored vehicles, secure entry teams, and flashing lights that reflected off corporate logos smeared beneath helicopters hovering overhead. By mid-morning, multiple executives had been escorted out in handcuffs. Ross Warren, 2 legal VPs, even board members tied to Solintrex's shell entity. Trent Marshall was under federal subpoena, his empire dissolving in real time. Charlene watched it unfold on TV, sitting in a small observation room, with Walter, Kara, and a few civil rights lawyers. She had no uniform now, only a gray blazer, and quiet pride. Kara held her hand, her eyes steady. Walter smiled softly, relief etched deep into the lines of his face. All the way down, Walter said. They finally pushed. Charlene let out a shallow breath. It's bigger than me now. That afternoon, news outlets declared the case era-defining. Media framed Charlene not as the disgruntled maid, but as the trigger for corporate accountability. Civil rights organizations rallied around her, calling the case a turning point in race-informed whistleblower protections. In the Capitol, lawmakers cited her story in committee hearings. Senators quoted the dustpan truth, and lawyers argued that current protections didn't shield workers like her. People who were paid to stay silent, not sign NDAs they never saw. It didn't take long. The Davis Whistleblower Protection Act was introduced. It proposed legal immunity for workers who exposed corporate wrongdoing, banning covert smear tactics, and pre-written HR hits aimed at silencing marginalized employees. Charlene's name became attached to every press release, a black woman whose whisper echoed across an entire system. Charlene's life transformed overnight. She was inundated with invitations to speak at universities, at legal conferences, at festivals aligned with social justice. She appeared in major magazines and documentaries. People asked if she felt uncomfortable being thrust into the spotlight. She said no. One evening, in a televised interview framed as questions the world wants answered, the host leaned in. "Do you regret speaking up?" Charlene paused. Behind her were framed clauses from the Davis Act, pinned on the wall. She smiled faintly. "No," she said. "They heard me now." Still, she knew it wasn't over. There were deeper shadows beneath institutional collapse. That evening, in a cramped meeting room behind the courthouse, Kara read her part of the Davis bill to her in low voice. No corporation may adopt internal procedures to preemptively discredit an employee who reports misconduct. All smear campaigns identified in leaked documents shall result in automatic review within 1 year. Kara wiped her eyes. Voice tight. "We finally made them pay." Charlene hugged her. "No one else gets erased." In public, Charlene remained composed. She walked into rooms, heads turned, but privately, each flash of a camera threatened to reopen old wounds. The uniform of invisibility had been replaced by a cloak of public attention, heavy, bright, unrelenting. One night, walking to her parking spot after a speaking engagement, she froze outside her car. A lone figure, a young janitor she once employed to help care for her mother, stood in the glow of a street lamp. The girl held a folded note. "From your employer, 2022, the girl said softly. "Sister asked me to give it." Charlene took the envelope with shaking hands. It read, "Thank you for teaching me dignity in the workplace. Ever clean." Charlene smiled wide. Tears tangled with streetlight shimmering ahead. Washington hearings advanced the bill quickly. Politicians from both parties spoke to its necessity, for economic equity as well as civil rights. Charlene testified before committees. She ended her statement with a simple sentence. "I cleaned floors for 8 years, but I wiped more than surfaces. I wiped away their lies. So they knew I was watching." She concluded with a soft fist raised. Not for optics but for principle. Cameras flew. News networks ran her snippet in evening broadcasts. Headlines called her the voice who made silence unbearable. Internally, Evercast's boardroom was in tatters. The company's stock had plummeted. Wall Street analysts downgraded stock, citing unchecked leadership malpractice and corporate ethics failures. Class action lawsuits emerged from investors, alleging misrepresentation not of promise, but of character. Trent was indicted. Kara cooperated. Ross turned state's evidence. The slush infrastructure behind Evercast began to unravel like a frayed spool. Charlene heard the echo of the word trust fade each time a former ally flipped. Weeks later, Charlene stood backstage at a leadership summit organized by civil rights activists and business rethinkers. The theme, visible labor, visible truth. She peered out at the audience through a curtain. The crowd was diverse: janitors, teachers, lawyers, tech workers, and students of color. Banners read, "They heard her." She inhaled. Her heartbeat hummed steady. Jada Hill stepped up beside her. With a nod, they walked onto a raised stage. 2 black women, 2 stories intertwined from underground podcast shadows to national reckoning. Charlene stood at the lectern, looking out over faces who believed her voice mattered. She swallowed, closed her eyes, and smiled. As the summit ended, A journalist tracked her backstage. Handing over a phone, she whispered, "Federal agents are here now. They want to speak with you tomorrow. It's about the broader network." Charlene nodded. She tucked the phone into her bag. Did she feel fear? A flicker. But also resilience. She had faced erasure. She had faced a raid. She had faced being framed in whiteboard font. Now she had to face what came next. Structural transformation. Finally, in a rare interview with a black think tank network, Charlene was asked, "What's next for you?" She paused, not looking for applause, but for clarity. Then she answered, "I'm going to walk into boardrooms. Not as a visitor, but as someone invited." Her voice echoed off the studio walls like declaration, and that was where this chapter closed. Yet, even as she stepped out into daylight, a shadow lingered, the kind that promised change but whispered that every door opened carried responsibility. The next scene had begun, but she hadn't seen the whole script yet. In a final scene, Charlene walks into a different boardroom, as an invited speaker. They erased her badge, her voice, her name, but they couldn't erase the truth she carried. For every worker made invisible, for every whisper they tried to silence. The world is finally listening. Type yes if you believe her voice matters. Subscribe if this broke your heart.